They learn to hold silence like a blade, precise, patient, unreadable. In rooms lit by the blue of screens and the yellow of stubborn lamps, words thinned until only the ache remained. Listeners became experiments, reactions catalogued with cold curiosity. Tonight, I asked you not to lean closer, but to sit inside the quiet. This channel does not teach comfort. It opens the mouth of absence and listens too. It begins with something small, a single sentence, a request, a question you thought deserved an answer. But instead, nothing. The silence arrived like a locked door, not slammed, not rattled, not even visible at first. Only later would you realize the weight of it. The air at 2 a.m. carried it like a bruise, spreading slowly, pulsing without sound. You heard the refrigerator hum, a mechanical mercy in a room where no human word survived. You shifted your shoes against the floor, careful not to break the ritual of distance, because by then, you already understood. Silence itself had become the conversation. Psychologists have studied this weapon. They call it stonewalling, a form of withdrawal where one partner refuses to engage. Others call it the silent treatment. It masquerades as peace, but it is not peace. It is punishment. In research by John Gottman, the pioneer of relationship studies, stonewalling was found to flood the body with stress. Heart rates rose, cortisol spiked, the recipient's nervous system entered a state of hypervigilance, waiting for a word that never came. Imagine a body preparing for conflict, but starved of the cues it needs to respond. You become suspended in a kind of psychological airlock, oxygen thinning. And here's the paradox. The longer the silence, the louder it became. You tried to explain yourself. You asked again. You repeated what you thought had been misunderstood, but the silence did not move. It catalogued you, like a pinned insect in a drawer. Every gesture of yours was noted, every attempt at speech measured, and the silence wrote its record, not with words, but with absence. Do you remember the way your chest tightened? The way you scanned their posture for hidden messages? Did the averted eyes mean rage or indifference? Was the folded arm a fortress or a funeral? When silence ruled, interpretation became your prison. And interpretation is endless. The invisible iron door is not merely closed. It is reinforced by your own thoughts. Here is where the punishment cuts deepest. The one delivering silence is not expending effort. They conserve energy, withdraw, retreat behind the iron barrier. But you, the subject, spend everything. You spend hours, nights, days, trying to decipher the code. The iron door is invisible because it's not built from their refusal alone. It's built from your own imagination, layering explanations until you are trapped behind it, too. You tell yourself, maybe they're tired, maybe they need space, maybe I pushed too far, but each explanation feeds the cycle. Each self-blame secures the lock. Consider a case file. A woman in her 30s, documented in a 2015 clinical study, described her partner's silence as a room that ate all the air. Whenever she raised concerns, he vanished into muteness for days. No calls, no acknowledgement, just the absence. She reported that after a while, she began apologizing without knowing what for, offering peace offerings to an altar she could not see. This is the hidden architecture of control. The silent treatment shifts the burden from the one withholding to the one receiving. The victim becomes the repairer, the pleader, the supplicant. Silence becomes a stage on which guilt is performed until compliance is achieved, and compliance is always noticed. You wonder now, was the silence worse than shouting? Shouting wounds, yes. It bleeds into memory with sharpness, but silence is not a cut. Silence is a suffocation. When someone shouts at you, the boundaries are clear. Enemy, anger, explosion. But when someone erases their voice entirely, you lose the anchor. You cannot tell whether you are hated or simply unseen. You drift, and drifting is endless. That is why survivors of silent treatment describe it as more damaging than arguments. Words can at least be contested. Silence cannot. It only multiplies in the dark. Picture again the living room at 2 a.m. The lamps low, air heavy. You shift on the couch. The other figure sits motionless. Their silence wraps the space like a second wallpaper. You imagine opening the iron door. You imagine demanding sound, but your throat dries because you already know what waits. Nothing. And so, you start rehearsing. You try the "I'm sorry" script. You try the "it's fine, let's forget it" script. You try silence back, but yours is a brittle imitation. Theirs is stone, yours is glass, and glass always breaks first. Researchers have compared the effects of ostracism, the broader term for deliberate social exclusion, to physical pain. In a famous 2003 study, participants played a virtual ball-tossing game. When the computer-controlled players stopped passing the ball to them, subjects reported distress identical to physical injury. Brain scans confirmed. The anterior cingulate cortex, the same region that processes pain, lit up. Your nervous system cannot distinguish between a slap and an absence. Both are violence. But silence carries one more cruelty. It denies you the proof of its existence. If bruises appeared, you could point to them. If words had been screamed, you could recount them. But silence erases its own tracks, leaving you doubting whether anything happened at all. And that is where it controls you most. You begin to question yourself. You begin to wonder, am I too sensitive? You tell yourself others endure worse, but the iron door knows better. It does not need to convince you. It only needs to make you doubt yourself. Doubt is the real punishment. Because doubt silences you too. Listen closely. Do you hear it? The hum of the refrigerator, the sound of your own pulse, the invisible machinery of control. The silence has become the environment itself. It is no longer one person withholding. It is the room, the night, the very air that refuses to respond. And in that moment, you are no longer in dialogue. You are in captivity. The iron door closed on explanation and did not open again. Not that night. Not the next morning. Maybe not for years. It waits, heavy and invisible, reminding you that words can be withdrawn as easily as they are given. So the question remains, if silence can erase truth itself, how will you know when you've been locked in? And what if the one holding the key was always you? The tape stutters here. The room is still, but the air feels bruised. The refrigerator hum fades. You lean closer, waiting for the silence to break. But the iron door remains, locked, waiting. Session terminated. The office looked harmless. Polite walls, the color of fading parchment, chairs placed with deliberate distance, coffee cooling on the desk, its steam winding into air already sterilized by antiseptic. Yet every detail was arranged like a stage, and you had already stepped into the experiment. Notebooks lay open, pages white and surgical. They waited like trays for dissection, ready to catalog what would not be spoken. For here, in this beige silence, words were not the instrument. Their absence was the therapist, or was it a researcher or a manipulator, leaned back and wrote without urgency. Every time you spoke, the pencil moved. Every time you paused, the pencil paused. But when you asked a question, when you begged for an answer, there was nothing, only the scratching sound of graphite retreating into another margin. You thought silence belonged to the domestic sphere, to arguments at 2 a.m., to the invisible iron doors of Chapter 1. But here, in the clinical glow of daylight, silence revealed itself as a mechanism, not an accident. not a weakness, a deliberate tactic. Psychology has a term for this: strategic omission, the withholding of feedback, information, or acknowledgement as a means of control. In interrogation manuals, silence is described as a laver. When a subject demands clarity, the absence of response increases their anxiety, making them more likely to speak, to confess, to fill the void. In therapy gone wrong, silence becomes a scalpel, cutting not to heal but to open space for dependence. The client waits for acknowledgement, for reflection, but instead finds the therapist's expression a mask of restraint. Each withheld word becomes a hook, and the subject learns to dig into themselves more deeply, desperate to appease the silence. You are no longer seeking truth. You are performing for the blankness. Do you remember the rustle of paper? How sharp it sounded in the quiet. It was not accidental. Every shift of the notebook, every pause of the pen, every sip of coffee became a substitute for speech. These movements said, "I am listening, I am recording, I am judging," but they never said what. And that omission is the most dangerous weapon of all, because silence does not merely deny you answers. It forces you to become your own accuser. A file was once uncovered. Notes from a 1960s study on interpersonal withholding. Subjects were paired with interviewers trained to respond with increasing silence, punctuated only by the sound of writing. Within minutes, participants reported feelings of shame, frustration, and panic. Some began to over-explain, others withdrew entirely, others grew tearful. The silence itself had sculpted behavior. You think silence is empty? It is not. It is full of your own projections. Look around this beige office again. You speak, and no reply comes. The chair across from you remains still. The coffee cools. The pencil hovers. You start to fill in the blanks. You imagine their judgment. You script their thoughts. You hear a phantom voice inside your skull. You are wrong. You are foolish. You are guilty. But that voice is not theirs. It is yours. This is how silence colonizes the mind. It does not need to accuse you. It teaches you to accuse yourself. The weapon works because it is deniable. When you confront the wielder, "Why didn't you answer me? Why did you say nothing?" They shrug. They insist silence is neutral, that you are imagining hostility. But silence is never neutral. Silence deployed in context is a message encrypted without letters. Imagine the courtroom where a witness pleads the fifth. Silence there is heavy with implication. Imagine a doctor who pauses too long after reading your test results. Silence there is unbearable. Imagine a parent staring blankly at a child's confession. Silence there is punishment. Each omission is a sentence written in invisible ink. In therapy, silence is sometimes praised as a tool. Skilled therapists use it to allow clients to expand, to reflect, to confront themselves. But even here, the line is perilously thin when silence becomes prolonged, strategic, sharpened. It stops being a container for thought and becomes a cage. You are not being given space. You are being abandoned inside it, and still, you try to decode it. Was the pen tapping approval or disdain? Was the cough a subtle response? Did the crossing of legs mean closure or merely comfort? Every gesture is magnified into a clue, every detail recorded in your private panic. You are caught in what researchers call hyperinterpretation, the overanalysis of ambiguous signals under conditions of stress. This is the true engine of the soft weapon, not the silence itself, but what your mind does to survive it. The file closes with an ellipse, 3 small dots. It is the symbol of unfinished business, of something withheld, a cliff edge with no bridge. That is how silence works. It never concludes. It leaves you suspended, waiting for the next word that may never arrive. You have been taught that communication is linear: statement, response, closure. But here, in this beige room, the sequence is disrupted. Statement, void, endless anticipation. The mechanics of silence are soft because they do not strike you. They reshape you. They bend your need for connection into a weapon turned inward. Think now. How many times have you been answered not with words, but with absence? How often have you mistaken the lack of response for neutrality when it was strategy? How many ellipses have been carved into your memory, leaving you unfinished? The office empties now. The coffee is cold. The notebooks are closed. You rise, unsure whether anything was truly said, but you carry the silence with you, heavier than speech. It clings to your ribs, humming like a secret you cannot put down, and the question gnaws: if silence itself is a tactic. How many of your conversations were never conversations at all, but controlled experiments? The page ends with 3 dots. The pencil falls quiet. The beige walls lean closer. Somewhere, a file remains unfinished. A chart with no final line. You step into the corridor, carrying only the silence. It follows. It waits. The hallway stretched like a tunnel, painted in a yellow that had long since surrendered to gray. Posters clung to the walls with curling corners, slogans half legible, concerts, protests, missing cats. Their colors had faded, but their silence remained. It was late, always late when truths tried to escape. The hum of the vending machine replaced conversation. A fluorescent light flickered above the stairwell, and the linoleum floor carried every footstep like a confession, unwilling to die. Someone spoke. A confession slipped into the corridor like smoke, but instead of words returning, only the hollow echo responded. Here, silence was not only a punishment, it was a mirror. In the psychology of groups, silence does not erase a voice. It reflects it back with distortion. The echo of your words becomes proof that no one else will carry them. The corridor repeats you, but emptier, lonelier, until you begin to doubt whether you ever spoke at all. Students know this better than most. Late-night dorm conversations are laboratories of fear. Secrets about family, about love, about harm, whispered between the peeling posters. Each secret becomes a test. If silence follows, the confession transforms into evidence against you. You cannot erase what you said. You can only wait for its weight to grow colder. Researchers call this social ostracism, the deliberate ignoring of a person's presence, speech, or needs. But unlike a direct rejection, no, I don't believe you, ostracism is subtler, crueler. It withholds acknowledgement, leaving you to wonder whether your reality was even registered. In the 1990s, a series of studies by Kipling-Williams used a simple computer game, Cyberball. Participants tossed a digital ball to one another. When 2 of the players stopped throwing the ball to the third, the excluded subject reported sharp distress. Anxiety, shame, isolation. Brain scans revealed pain centers activated just as if they had been physically injured. Imagine this not as a game, but as your life. Your words tossed into the air, never caught, never returned. The silence itself becomes the injury. In the dorm hallway, footsteps answered instead of speech. A door closed at the far end, and you felt your confession tighten around you like a noose. You saw the witnesses, the way their eyes lingered, the way their notebooks opened in invisible lines of memory. Every clenched fist, every reddened eye, every stilled breath was noted, catalogued. This is another layer of the silence, the archive of the unspoken. Students carried these records like forensic evidence. Who broke down in the kitchen? who stopped speaking in class, who walked the halls at 3 a.m. with swollen eyes. These details were not shouted. They were filed, in whispers, in margins, in rumors that outlived the semester, and what was once a moment of pain became cold evidence against you. Silence here was not absence. It was surveillance. Every pause, every withheld word, every failure to respond became data, coded into the language of dorm gossip. You learned to edit yourself, to anticipate which confessions would echo hollow and which would receive a nod, a word, a saving grace of recognition. This is the soft tyranny of peer groups. Silence as a selective filter. You are not erased all at once. You are erased piece by piece until only the approved fragments of you remain. Consider the case of Kay, a student from a 2010 ethnographic study on dorm life. She described telling her roommate about a sexual assault. The roommate said nothing, only nodded once, then turned away. Days later, Kay overheard whispers. Her story had spread, but stripped of detail, treated as spectacle. Kay reported feeling haunted by silence more than words. This is the paradox. Silence does not stay still. It leaks, it shifts, it spreads like cold through concrete. You walk the hallway again in memory. You hear your own voice repeated in the echo. It sounds thinner, smaller, already corrupted. You ask yourself, did I exaggerate? Did I imagine it? The silence pushes the questions back against you. You become both the confessor and the accused. This is where the mechanics grow sharper. Silence in a group is never neutral. In organizational psychology, group silence often signals power dynamics. Fear of authority, fear of exclusion, fear of retaliation. People do not stay quiet because they agree. They stay quiet because the risk of acknowledgement is heavier than the guilt of withholding. In the dorm hallway, the silence was not empty. It was complicit. It said, "We heard you. We will not answer." And that too is an answer. Red eyes, clenched hands, the stilling of breath. These were the only records kept. No one wrote the words down, not officially. No professor filed the pain into a report, but memory kept its private notebooks, and in those margins, the silence grew colder each day. Colder because unacknowledged experiences decay. Colder because what is not spoken hardens into myth. Colder because your own memory begins to betray you, asking whether it ever happened at all. Silence becomes evidence when it repeats. The second time you are ignored, it is confirmation. The third time, it is verdict. By the 10th, you no longer need words. Your body understands the law. Speak less. Expect nothing. Carry your evidence in secret. And so the silence reproduces itself, carried from one hallway to the next, one generation to another. But what if silence itself is the lie? What if the witnesses heard more than they admitted? What if every clenched hand was a confession too, one they dared not speak? And what if the silence that haunted you was also protecting them? The dorm grows quiet again. The vending machine hums. The posters peel. Some records remain only in the margins, never reaching the light of testimony. They wait there, cold, unfinished, haunting, and you walk the hallway one more time, wondering if your words were ever yours to begin with, or if they were swallowed the moment they left your mouth, becoming echoes that served only as evidence against you. The corridor flickers, one light buzzing faintly. Footsteps retreat into the stairwell. The echo of your words lingers, hollow and unfinished. Somewhere, a notebook closes, its margins colder than ink. The room was bright, too bright. The kind of light that erases shadows but not dread. Fluorescent tubes hummed overhead, buzzing like electric insects. White walls, steel chairs, clipboards lined neatly on the counter. A jar of candy sat in the corner, red wrappers, cheerful, untouched. The sweetness was bait, not comfort. The real sweetness here was data. You were not a patient. You were not even a student. You were a subject. Wires crawled across your skin, sticky pads pressed against your chest. Your pulse fed into a monitor. Every breath, every twitch, every delayed response was a number. And the numbers told a story louder than words ever could. The story of stress, the story of control, the story of silence. The researchers did not need to shout. They did not need to punish. They simply withheld. You asked a question, and their gaze slipped past you. You gave an answer, and the clipboard remained still. You tried to catch their eyes, and they turned back to the monitor. Each act of withdrawal was a small incision. The beeping machine tracked the wound. Your heart raced. Your cortisol spiked. The data was clean, undeniable. Silence alone could bruise the body. This was not theory. It was history. In the mid-20th century, psychologists began cataloging what silence and neglect could do to the human organism. Studies of infants in understaffed orphanages revealed developmental delays, sickness, even death, not from lack of food or warmth, but from lack of response. The absence of a caregiver's voice or gaze was lethal. Later in labs like this one, adults became the new subjects. Ostracism games, withholding tasks, scripted refusals. Every experiment proved the same bleak fact. Social silence is not neutral. It is an assault on the nervous system. Your body does not know the difference between being struck and being ignored. The jar of candy glowed in its corner. One researcher shifted, making a note. The wrapper crinkled in your imagination, but never in reality. Because silence starves appetite. The body forgets sweetness when it is fed only absence. Consider the experiment of timeouts in child psychology. Originally framed as a nonviolent discipline strategy, it relied not on hitting, but on withholding attention. The child misbehaved. The parent withdrew. Silence as punishment. It worked, not because the child reflected, but because the hunger for reconnection became unbearable. Now extend that principle here, in this fluorescent box. You are the child. They are the parents. Every withheld word is a leash. Every silence is a yank, and compliance grows. The researchers knew the formula. Attention given us to choice. Attention withdrawn. Obedience. Blankness bends the will like light bends through glass. You began altering your answers, softer, quicker, more agreeable. You leaned forward, eager for a nod, a flicker, any sign of acknowledgement. The absence shaped you, carved you, without a single command spoken aloud. That was the secret power of the laboratory. Silence as invisible architecture. No whips, no shouts, only omission, and the subject remade themselves. The beeping monitor did not lie. At first, your heartbeat jumped erratically, the panic of abandonment. Then it slowed, not from calm, but from surrender. Resignation is its own kind of rhythm, and they wrote it down. Graphs rising, falling, charts labeled with sterile codes. Your pain became ink, your compliance a bar graph. You were no longer a person. You were a pattern. Think about that mirror. At the start of the study, you recognized yourself, your tone, your questions, your words. But as silence sculpted your behavior, you noticed the fracture. You watched yourself bend, soften, obey. You saw your reflection alter into something compliant, eager, diminished. When the experiment ended, the wires removed, the candy jar still untouched. You left the lab, but the mirror stayed cracked, because you could not unknow how easily you bent. And isn't that the cruelest discovery? Not that others can manipulate you, but that you, given enough silence, will manipulate yourself. Silence is often dressed in white coats and fluorescent light, disguised as neutrality, professionalism, data collection. But in truth, it is a soft violence, administered with precision. What did the researchers feel as they noted your reactions? Did they pity you? Did they relish the elegance of the mechanism? Or did they feel nothing at all, convinced that silence was merely a tool? The candy jar remained sealed. You wondered later whether anyone had ever eaten from it, or whether it was only there as a symbol. The sweetness you would not receive, the acknowledgement that would never come. Every silence hides a promise of sound, like candy, wrapped and waiting. But here, the promise was the weapon. You left the lab. The lights buzzed behind you. The clipboard filled another drawer, another archive of hurt. But your reflection stayed behind, fractured, trembling. You had learned that silence could bend you. You had learned that blankness could break you, and that knowledge never leaves. The fluorescent lights flicker once more. A monitor flatlines into quiet. Somewhere, a clipboard closes, but the candy jar remains untouched. The lab dissolves, but the crack in the mirror follows you home. Experiment terminated. Subject not restored. The table gleamed under a single bulb, a bowl of soup, a loaf of bread, plates arranged with a precision so old it no longer needed instruction. Forks aligned, glasses half-filled, napkins folded into obedience. This was not dinner. This was ritual. You sat there, waiting. Steam curled from the food, carrying warmth, carrying promise. But warmth is not the same as welcome. The promise was only texture, not substance. Words floated at first, half questions about school, faint praise for grades, inquiries about work undone, and then the pauses began. Silence at a dinner table is not an accident. It is not absence. It is a signal. Parents learned long ago how to wield it. A clink of a fork on porcelain, then nothing. A sip of water, then nothing. The empty space did the work. You shifted in your chair, feeling the weight of what was not said. You spoke once, twice, but the responses cooled. Eyes remained on plates, hands busied themselves with bread. That was the strike, not voice, but its withdrawal. Research has long shown this cruelty. Developmental psychologists call it the still face effect. A caregiver, instructed to hold a neutral, unresponsive expression, watches as an infant flails, crying, reaching, contorting, begging for reaction. Within minutes, the child collapses into despair, movements slowing, eyes dimming. The laboratory version is only seconds long, but in families, it can stretch for years. Salt lingered on your tongue. You tasted it differently now. Not seasoning, but message. Salt as punishment. The food rich, but the air barren. You chewed, and it scraped like sand. Every pause at this table was a lever. Every withheld glance was a vote. In a game you did not know you were playing. Your siblings knew the scoreboard. One word too sharp, and their plate was served with a silence. One misstep, and the laughter skipped over them like a stone over water. So they studied it. Who received the parent's question? Who received the nod? Who was ignored? Attention was currency, and silence was debt. You learned to measure worth, not in love, but in pauses. Silence is sticky. It clings to childhood and hardens into adulthood. Families who discipline with withdrawal produce children who carry that hunger forever. Neuroscience confirms this. The anterior cingulate cortex, the brain's pain center, fires when you are excluded, just as it does when you are burned or cut. You bleed invisibly at the table. No bandage is offered. The wound is denial itself. Steam rose from the dishes. but the words cooled. You remember the rhythm. A question asked, a wrong answer, the sudden stillness, and then the long descent into ritual, the scraping of knives, the swallowing of soup, the practiced avoidance of what was meant to sting. Dinner became theater, and silence was the script. The family living room closed the evening. Chairs arranged around a flickering television. A couch sagged under the weight of history, and there, one chair always empty, no one sat there. No one asked why. It became a shrine to absence itself. Was it for the sibling who left? For the parent who refused? For the ghost of attention that never arrived? You could not say, but you felt it every night. The reminder that silence was not random. It had architecture. It had a seat reserved. Consider the term emotional neglect. Not abuse in the dramatic sense, not violence that leaves visible scars, but the systematic absence of acknowledgement. The child is fed, clothed, even praised at times, but their inner world goes unrecognized. The discipline is not what is done, but what is withheld. Families perfect this art, not out of science, but out of repetition. Silence becomes a family heirloom, passed down like salt shakers and recipes. Each generation seasons their meals with a pause, a withheld glance, a ritual omission, and the cycle holds. You sat in that cycle, fork clinking against porcelain, a hand reaching for bread, the silence stretching. You felt yourself growing smaller, words shriveling before they reached your lips. The air was heavy, not because of steam, but because of omission. It was not what was said that scarred you. It was what never arrived. The scoreboard tallied itself. Who laughed with father? Who earned mother's question? Who was left to eat in quiet? And when the night ended, the empty chair stood as reminder. Not everyone wins. Someone always eats alone, even when surrounded. Your reflection cracked in that chair, not because of shouting, not because of hitting, but because the silence proved louder. And silence, once learned at the dinner table, follows you, into partnerships, into workplaces, into your own children's eyes. You replicate it without meaning to. You withdraw when you should respond. You pause when you should acknowledge. You weaponize absence. The family taught you how salt on the food, silence in the air, a scoreboard of glances and omissions, a chair that no one dared to claim. That was dinner. That was ritual. That was the softest, deepest cut. The meal ended long ago, but the salt lingers on your tongue. The plates are washed, the chairs pushed in, but the empty seat remains. It waits, untouched, whispering its inheritance forward. Tomorrow's dinner will look the same. Will you notice the silence before it notices you? The office shimmered with glass and polish. Every surface reflected order. Every reflection suggested success. But glass does more than shine. It isolates. It keeps the world in view, but just beyond touch. 9:30 a.m. The city hummed below like a distant organ, steady, relentless. The office above pulsed to a different rhythm, the syncopated ding of incoming emails, the shuffled footsteps of professionals navigating invisible hierarchies. And in that rhythm, silence waited. At first you thought it was an accident, an email left unanswered, a question ignored in the morning meeting, a suggestion brushed aside with a smile, but without acknowledgement. But repetition transforms accident into tactic. You noticed patterns. Your colleague's message vanished into the void, marked read, but never replied, their name absent from the meeting invite, their suggestion repeated later by someone else, suddenly praised. The silence became evidence, but no one wrote it down. Psychologists call this the ostracism effect. It begins subtly, not receiving eye contact, not being greeted, not being included. Research shows that even short episodes of exclusion activate the brain's pain circuitry. Social pain in scans looks alarmingly like physical injury. In corporate halls, this pain isn't accidental. It is engineered to erase a person. You don't need to confront them. You only need to stop answering. The glass office was a stage, meetings filled with polite nods. But silence divided the script. Promotion announcements skipped one name. Tasks flowed to others. A suggestion lingered unacknowledged, then reappeared from a favored mouth. Reputations eroded not by accusation, but by omission. A career could collapse not with a scandal, but with a shrug. And silence, once embedded, was contagious. Colleagues learned quickly. Do not respond to the outcast. Do not align yourself with the ghost. To answer them was to risk being erased yourself. Imagine the elevator ride. You step in. No one follows. The mirrored walls trap your reflection like evidence of absence. You realize the floor beneath you has shifted, not physically but socially. You are still in the same building, but the hierarchy has moved without you. You are one level lower, though the elevator numbers never changed. The soft weapon thrives here because the office worships politeness. Open cruelty is frowned upon. Lawsuits await sharp edges, but silence leaves no paper trail. You cannot file a complaint for an unanswered email. You cannot prove that the invitation you never received was withheld intentionally. You cannot demand a colleague to acknowledge you. Silence wears no fingerprints. There are studies that mirror this. In one, subjects were placed in a simple computer game called Cyberball, a virtual ball toss. At first, everyone is included. Then suddenly, one player is ignored. The ball never returns. Within minutes, that player reports distress, anger, despair. Heart rate increases, sense of belonging collapses. The cruel part, the ball is meaningless, but the silence around it is not. Now imagine Cyberball stretched over years, disguised as corporate teamwork. That is how offices fracture souls. You recall the colleague who sat at their desk, typing diligently, while their inbox filled with nothing. They arrived early, stayed late, produced reports. Yet the silence hollowed their presence. The office moved around them as if they were furniture. Their work was not attacked. It was ignored. Their face was not insulted. It was unseen. Slowly, their confidence bled out. They spoke less, offered fewer suggestions, began to take the elevator down earlier each day, avoiding the glass cage altogether. Until one morning, their chair was empty. No one spoke about it. The office swallowed the absence. Silence as command has mechanics. Withhold response. Deny recognition. Make the other scramble for validation. Exclude from flow. Meeting invites vanish. Projects reassign. The ghost left in waiting. Erase reputation. When silence meets achievement, credit reroutes elsewhere. This is not random neglect. It is precision. In the politics of glass offices, silence becomes both leash and noose. And you feel it even now, when your question hangs in a boardroom and no one answers, when your message is marked as seen but never replied to, when a colleague's joke earns laughter, but yours dissolves into nothing. You begin to wonder, is it you? Did you misstep? Or has the machinery of omission already selected you as its subject? The silence never tells. The psychology of power thrives on this ambiguity. Machiavelli suggested it centuries ago. Control need not always strike. Sometimes it only needs to refrain. Absence as demonstration, distance as proof. Leaders learn that silence compels more compliance than command. A withheld promotion makes the survivors scramble harder. A silent room forces the anxious to fill it with obedience. Noise is risky. Silence is surgical. And yet silence corrodes both ways. The wielder, too, becomes addicted. Managers rely on it because it demands no explanation. Colleagues adopt it because it costs nothing. Entire departments are rot from within, polite to the end, but hollowed by omission, until the day the company crumbles, and no one can explain why. Because the silence had erased even the warnings, the elevator doors close again. This time, you are inside, alone. The mirrored walls reflect you not once, but 1,000 times. Each reflection asks the same question. How many unread messages does it take before you vanish? You reach the lobby, but the ground no longer feels solid. The floor moved while you were working, and no one warned you. The office lights dim, the emails stop, but silence still works the night shift. It moves through servers, through glass, through polished hallways. It decides who rises and who disappears. And tomorrow, when you walk through those glass doors again, will you hear your name, or only the echo of its absence? Rain traced veins across the glass. Inside, the room was warm, lit with the soft glow of two bodies learning one another. Hands tentative, laughter spilling, voices finding a rhythm. The first stage of courtship is always intoxication. Mystery is an aphrodisiac. You don't answer every question. You don't reveal every thought. Desire is born in the spaces between. But what happens when those spaces grow? When silence stops being a flirtation and becomes the foundation? It began with a text. You sent one. It lingered unread. The minutes swelled, then hours. Then the relief when a reply finally arrived. A simple word, a small phrase, enough to reset your pulse, enough to prove you still existed in their world. This is the first mechanism, intermittent reinforcement. Psychologists know its cruelty. Beafscombe. Skinner's pigeons pecked at levers endlessly, not because they were always rewarded, but because they were rewarded sometimes. The uncertainty itself becomes the hook. So you waited, so you chased, so you fed the very silence that drained you. At first, it felt like style. They were busy. They needed space. They weren't like the others who clung too tightly. Their distance was intoxicating, proof of self-control, proof of worth. You told yourself, this is what makes them different. This is why I want them. But the difference cut deeper. The unanswered texts became longer. The phone calls dwindled. The meetings were postponed. And when they finally arrived, their presence was electric, precisely because it was rare. Absence had become the bait. There is a tactic in manipulation. Love, withdrawal. Developmental psychologists observed it first in parent-child relationships. A parent shows warmth, affection, praise, but retracts it when displeased. The child scrambles, internalizing a rule. Affection must be earned. In romance, the same cycle repeats. You fall into orbit around a star that flickers on and off. You learn to cling during the dark, praying for the next burst of light. It is not love you chase. It is the end of absence. The apartment window knew this story. Rain slid down in streaks, each droplet a reminder of separation. Inside, you waited for the vibration of the phone, for the glow of the screen. Every sound in the night could be them. Every silence was their decision not to answer. The power tilted. Your longing fed theirs, and when they finally touched you, when they whispered, when they smiled, the contrast was overwhelming. You confused the relief of absence ending with love itself. The science is merciless. Attachment researchers call it anxious, preoccupied style. It grows in people who never knew consistent warmth. Each delay in response triggers panic. Each reunion floods with desperate joy. The manipulator doesn't need to scream, doesn't need to insult. They only need to withhold. Silence is enough. And so, the withholding became a pattern. They withheld text replies. They withheld explanations. They withheld touch at crucial moments, offering it later like a prize. Your brain rewired itself to chase. Dopamine spiked not at their presence, but at their rare attention. The absence was the stage. The reunion was the applause. It was not romance, it was training. At 3 a.m., your phone lit. Your chest surged. You reached for it, hungry, trembling, but it was nothing. An update, a background notification. The silence mocked you through the glow. The screen was full of light, but no message. Only the shape of absence, sharper than any word. You remembered the early days, the laughter, the touches, the way rain outside sounded like percussion to your closeness. That was bait, too. The mystery was always part of the snare. Now the rain was only reminder. You counted droplets like minutes, wondering which belonged to you and which were erased. In this form, silence seduces more efficiently than words. The manipulator does not need to insult you. They simply let you fill the gaps with your own fear. You imagine what they are doing, who they are with, why they did not answer. Your own mind completes their work. You destroy yourself, and they only have to withhold. The cruelty of this is how easily it hides. Outsiders see nothing. No bruises, no shouting. Only a normal romance with busy schedules, with communication styles. But underneath, the silence carves channels in your chest. Love should be a current. Here, it was a drought interrupted by floods. Love should be presence. Here, it was absence, performing as control. You began to measure love by the scale of your own panic, by the nights you couldn't sleep, by the days your messages went unanswered, and still you believed. Because when the reply finally came, when the absence ended, you felt whole again. But that wholeness was counterfeit. You were not filled with love. You were filled with relief. Relief is not affection. Relief is addiction. There is a paradox here. The more they withheld, the tighter you clung. This is the paradox of trauma bonds. Like hostages praising their captors, you worshipped the hand that starved you, because it was also the only hand that sometimes fed. The withholding was not random, it was currency, and you paid in time, in attention, in pieces of your sanity. Now, the window pane at night, rain falling, silence swelling, a phone glowing. You wait, as countless others have waited, for the reply that will prove you exist, for the silence to break, but the silence is the point. It is not accident, it is architecture, and you live inside it. The night does not end. The phone does not ring. The silence does not collapse. It grows until it feels like the only language left. What if love was never the presence at all? Only the absence that trained you to beg. The room smelled of paper and coffee gone cold. Maps spread across the wall, pins and strings marking districts, demographics, fault lines. Laptops glowed like lanterns in a cave. This was no accident. Silence had been drafted into strategy. A campaign war room is not only about promises. It is about absences, what to omit, who to ignore, when to let a question die unanswered. Every pause in speech was as intentional as every line in the script. The microphones stood ready, silver throats glistening under harsh lights. They did not belong to the people. They belonged to the handlers. Each stand was a gatekeeper. Each press release was a scalpel. A name could be elevated. A name could be erased. Silence was the eraser. You have seen it before. A question shouted from the crowd, met with a smile, a wave, but no reply. A journalist's inquiry cut from the transcript. A protest silenced not by force, but by omission. This is how politics wields absence, not through the loud spectacle of censorship, but through the quiet corrosion of what never reaches the record. Political psychologists call it agenda-setting theory. The media and campaigns do not tell you what to think, but they tell you what to think about. When silence deletes a topic, that topic ceases to exist in public memory. A missing word becomes a missing world. Consider the carefully chosen omissions. A scandal buried by refusing comment until fatigue makes the question dissolve. A policy failure ignored in speeches, erased by the steady substitution of safer topics. A voice from the margins never handed a microphone, left waiting in silence until exhaustion replaces hope. The absence is not neutral. It is weaponized. In the campaign war room, silence was tallied like currency. Do not respond. A strategist would whisper, "It will die on its own." Do not acknowledge. To answer is to give it weight. And so the silence grew. The microphones broadcasted only half-truths, the rest swallowed whole. The public felt it as unease. They asked questions that dissolved into walls. They felt dismissed without being confronted, erased without being named. And still, they waited, because silence demands patience, and patience is another leash. History is full of these blanks, entire movements erased by official silence, voices written out of textbooks, crimes swallowed by the phrase, "no comment." Consider the Tuskegee syphilis study. Decades of silence about men deliberately left untreated, their suffering ignored, until whistleblowers broke the wall. Consider the disappearances in authoritarian regimes. Names omitted from newspapers, photographs retouched to remove faces. The silence itself became terror, not speech, not denial, just nothing. Silence in politics is not quiet. It is thunder, inverted. Every unasked question grows in the dark. Every erased name echoes louder in the margins, but the public rarely hears those echoes, because the official record moves forward as if the missing never existed. The strategy is simple. What is not said cannot be debated. What is not recorded cannot be remembered. The harm seeps outward. Communities on the margins learn the bitter lesson. Wait longer, shout louder, still remain unheard. Activists discover that silence is the hardest opponent. It cannot be argued with, cannot be quoted, cannot be disproven. It is absence disguised as neutrality. Imagine a citizen reading the news, waiting for a line that never appears. The silence trains them too. Trains them to lower expectations, trains them to believe their concerns are fringe, unworthy, unreal. This is how silence becomes collective gaslighting. The people begin to doubt their own perception of what matters. Campaigns understand the rhythm. Flood the airwaves with noise about one issue, starve the others, reward loyalty with attention, punish dissent with omission. Let silence do the pruning, while speeches paint the illusion of inclusion. The result is not apathy. It is despair. Citizens learn not that they lack power, but that their voices never penetrate the glass. Silence corrodes democracy the way rust corrodes steel. Not sudden collapse, but steady weakening. until one day the structure falls without warning. And the official record, the history books, the speeches on tape, none of them mention the erosion. Only the missing pages testify. You sit now in that war room, metaphorically. You see the strings, the pins, the glowing screens, and you realize the quiet is not an accident. It is a decision. Every blank is deliberate. Every withheld word is a cut. And when history is written, silence will stand there too. Invisible ink on the margins, shaping the story as much as any speech. The microphones are turned off. The press leaves the room. The maps are folded away, but the silence lingers, written into the record like an invisible watermark. When tomorrow's history is printed, will you recognize the missing pages? Or will you only remember the words they allowed you to hear? The light in the clinic was muted, neither day nor night. It hummed faintly, like a bulb nearing its end. The air was warm, too still, carrying the faint sweetness of tea gone cool on a tray. The chairs were arranged in a circle, empty at first, waiting. This was where sound began again, not in speeches, not in declarations, but in timid syllables that had to crawl before they could stand. You notice how the bodies arrive, slowly, hesitant, like intruders stepping into a chapel where no faith has yet been proven. Shoes scuff, coats are folded too neatly, as if neatness might contain what has always spilled out. Then, a voice, a name, spoken low, fragile as porcelain. Another follows, and another. Names reclaim breath, names repair memory. Names remind the circle that there are still bodies attached to them, still throats willing to push against the hush. The tea is not drunk. It cools as ritual, not refreshment. Its presence matters because it implies care, however small, however delayed. Someone thought to set it there. Someone imagined that warmth might help coax voices out of hiding. Every small object in the room becomes symbolic. The chairs, equidistant equal, a geometry of fairness. The tray, an offering against absence. The dim light, merciful sparing shame, the spotlight. You remember the iron doors from before, the invisible walls that sealed away speech. You recall the laboratories, the offices, the dinners where silence punished. You recall how absence was made weapon. Here, recovery is not thunder. It is not revolution. It is a creak, a hinge moving for the first time in years. Psychologists call it the language of boundaries. The ability to say, I need, or I will not, or I will leave if. These phrases are not dramatic. They are skeletal, minimal, yet in their spareness lies survival. A person who has endured silence learns that a single sentence can act as crowbar, prying at a door, long thought sealed. You whisper it once, awkwardly, then again, firmer, and with repetition, the word grows muscle. The circle knows this rhythm. Each participant carries their fragments of voice, setting them like offerings in the center. One says, I need you to stop interrupting. Another adds, I feel fear when you don't answer. Another, if you leave again without telling me, I will not wait. These are not weapons, though they may sound sharp. They are repairs disguised as blades. They cut chains, not flesh. The silence in the room is different from before, not oppressive, not withholding. It is an attentive silence, a silence that holds, not erases. Every pause is permission. Every gap is space for the next trembling word. This is how you learn that silence can be reclaimed, too. It can be neutral. It can be sanctuary. Recovery never arrives as triumph. It arrives as stumbles, backslides, regressions. A voice that vanishes for weeks before returning. A chair that sits empty until one day, without warning, It does not. Even progress is fragile. A single glance can collapse weeks of courage. A raised voice can send someone fleeing from the circle. Yet fragility does not mean failure. It means growth, because growth by nature begins brittle. You recall the psychology of trauma recovery. Judith Herman wrote that safety, remembrance, and reconnection form its stages. Safety first, a circle where harm is impossible. Remembrance second, words spoken into air that once suffocated them. Reconnection last, the realization that others hear and others answer. In the clinic, you see those stages enacted without fanfare. The locked mouths trying keys again, the eyes lifting from the floor, the incremental risk of letting oneself be seen. One participant lifts a cup of tea, sips though it has gone lukewarm. The sound of liquid moving breaks the air like a small declaration. We are here, and we are still living. Another leans forward, knees shaking, and says the words that have weighed longest. They do not spill perfectly. They catch, they stumble, but the circle does not flinch. It waits, and in that waiting, the impossible becomes spoken. You realize something unsettling. Recovery itself is a form of defiance. It mocks the manipulator's goal. It interrupts the script where silence was supposed to reign forever. A single, "I need," destabilizes years of conditioning. A single, "I will leave," topples an empire of control. Simple phrases, yes, but simplicity is their violence against the elaborate architecture of harm. Still, nothing is permanent. Nothing is absolute. Some never return to the circle. Some drown again in the silence outside. Recovery is not guaranteed. It is only offered. The file, the notes, the clinical records, none of them promise closure. They end with ellipses. They end with questions, because healing is not a door that closes. It is one that cracks, then creaks, then resists, then finally opens wide enough for a shadow to slip through. And even then you look back, wondering if it will slam shut again. The circle thins. The chairs are emptied. The tea tray remains. Names were spoken tonight. That was enough. The file closes, not with a period, not with certainty, but with a question mark. The clinic light flickers once before extinguishing. The room is swallowed by dark, leaving only the faint smell of tea cooling in porcelain. The chairs remain in their circle, waiting. But when the door opens again, will you return to the chair? Or will you let silence reclaim what little sound has been born?